Toxic, arrogant, and full elitist streamer Saltagrepo finally got what he wanted, guys, and Div got nerfed. Obviously, that's a joke, but if you did look over the latest TWAB, Divinity is getting nerfed, and I believe it should be going live next Tuesday, which means Div will be going down from a 30% debuff to 15%, which is where a lot of the other current debuffs are at in the game. So the question is, will Div be worth using still? Yo, what's going on, guys? It's G-Miners here, and in this video, I'm going to be fully breaking down Divinity and going over some numbers to see where it is going to lie, and then ultimately if it's going to still be something that you should consider using. After all, even with a nerf to its debuff, the crit bubble is still super useful for most bosses in the game, allowing your damage to be much more consistent. And for weapons like linear fusion rifles that have a 2.5x crit multiplier, missing just a single crit is a huge loss in damage. So something like Divinity prevents these losses from happening. If you guys do like this content, make sure to drop a like and sub down below. Something is 100% free. It helps me out a ton, and you can always unsub later if you want. And with that said, let's take a look at some debuffs. This image right here is going to be our cheat sheet. All the current Destiny 2 debuffs are all seen here in 3 different tiers. First up is the Weakened tier, which is for 15% debuffs. This includes mostly the Void 3.0 abilities like Weakened Grenades and Child of the Old Gods, but then we also have Heart of Shadow and Collective Obligation. And keep in mind, Divinity will eventually be in this section after the change. For the second section, we have Tier 1, which is for 20% debuffs. The only universally useful debuff in this section is going to be Sundering Glare, which goes away at the end of this season. It will probably return down the road, but it isn't something that we can always rely on. And then for Tier 2, this is where we have the 30% debuffs. These are going to be Tether, Divinity, Tractor Cannon, and Fellwinter's Helm. Of these, I think Fellwinter's Helm is going to be the least useful for most teams and in endgame content settings. I have seen this used in speedruns and as an option when you need a debuff with a very limited loadout, but this will be the only 30% debuff that we don't talk about in this video because I don't think it's very viable. Now, currently in the game, if we do assume that every single person on your team deals around an equal amount of damage, which I am assuming because otherwise it would be kind of impossible to accurately look at DPS, then we can say that as a whole team, your team is dealing 100 DPS or damage per second just as a random value because it works out nicely. This means if we divide this by 6 for each player dealing damage, everybody should be dealing around 16.7 damage per second. Now, assume that we take one of these players away and place them on Divinity. Again, for this argument, I am assuming that the player who uses Divinity is dealing little to no damage, which tends to be pretty accurate when compared to the damage of other players. With the player on Divinity, before the debuff is applied, since we lose one player dealing damage, we lose 16.7 DPS, so we are now down to 83.3 damage per second. Applying Divinity at this point will give us a 1.3x multiplier, so we take the 83.3 multiply by 1.3, and we are at 108.3 damage per second, which means overall, with Divinity as a 30% debuff, our damage goes up by around 8%. When Divinity gets nerfed, this is going to mean that we are only getting a 15% damage increase, so we can use the exact same model and multiply 83.3 by 1.15, and we are now at around 96 damage per second, which is technically worse than if we didn't even use Div, but that doesn't mean Div is going to be useless. Lastly, if we do deal damage and just use Weaken Grenades or some other Weaken abilities, which still allow all players to deal damage, then we're going to end up at 115 DPS, and if we use something like Tether instead, that would be 130 DPS. The thing about these values, as I just showed, is that Div has always made your DPS worse than if you just used a Weaken Grenade. Yet we've been using Div as a constant meta DPS option for years now. So why? Well, as most people are aware, linear fusion rifles have been meta for almost exactly a year, and before that, we've gone through multiple precision-based metas too. Slug shotguns technically did higher DPS with a crit, even though they aren't precision-based, and before that, we had Izanagi's Burden. So the reason that Div has constantly made DPS better is because we're just hitting more crits. I mentioned in the beginning of the video that linear fusion rifles are precision-based weapons and hit 2.5x harder on headshots than body shots. When actually testing, I personally keep finding this to come out to around a 3.45x increase on crits, but either way, this makes a massive difference. Even if we just use the 2.5x value instead of the 3.4 that I found, using the numbers I have here, since we body shot for 16.6 thousand, this means if we hit a crit, which is 2.5 times higher, this would be closer to 41.5 thousand damage, which means that only 4 crit shots with a linear is equivalent to 10 body shots. So by using Divinity, you are more or less guaranteeing that you will hit every crit and drastically increase your DPS compared to someone who might hit some and miss some without Div. Eventually, when Divinity is reduced down to the 15% value, using something like Tractor Cannon or Tether would be a next best option to get the highest debuff. So I wanted to again compare that damage to the damage of using Divinity. Obviously, from our original damage values, where we assumed everyone was dealing the same amount of damage, nerfed Divinity came in around 96 DPS, and Tether would come in around 130 DPS, which is much higher because it allows each player to deal high amounts of damage. The issue is, this doesn't paint the full picture and assumes ideal circumstances. But if you factor in crits, as we just went over, Divinity ends up being extremely useful. Using the values I hit for when testing, a body shot was 16.6 thousand as we went over before, and then with the 3.45x increase on crits, I hit for 57.2 thousand damage. Once again, sources have shown that linears have a 2.5x crit multiplier, but when I tested, this ended up being much higher. With these values, 10 shots while using Div with the 15% increase in damage will come out to 657,000 total damage, and then 10 shots while using Tether, assuming we do hit all crits, will come to 743,000. This is obviously going to be our 15% damage difference as we expected. However, if you miss just 2 headshots during this process, your damage, even with the larger debuff, will drop down to 628,000 total damage, which means that if you have anything less than like an 80 to 85% headshot percentage while dealing damage, you are much better off just using Divinity rather than the higher debuff. At this point, I have gone over a bunch of different values and information when it comes to debuffs and using Div versus not using Div, so I wanted to sum everything up in a very easy to understand explanation. In my opinion, and based off of what I just went over, I think this nerf to Divinity makes little to no difference at all. The main reason to use Div is and has always been to hit consistent crits against bosses, and then also to have a long-lasting debuff. Currently hitting crits is super important because of how high the crit multiplier is for linear fusion rifles, which are meta. And as we went over, even if you use a larger debuff and end up missing 15 to 20% of your headshots, which is very common, your damage will be far worse than if you just use Div with a lower debuff percentage. On top of this, Bungie never stated that Divinity will override larger debuffs, which means if you do want to maximize your damage, adding in a Void Hunter on Quiver will give 16 seconds of a 30% debuff, and then when that runs out, Div will still give you a permanent 15%, and it will always be applied the entire time, so you will have access to hit easy crits. I do also think Tractor Cannon is another solid debuff option. I think this is going to be used a lot more when precision weapons are not needed or Divinity doesn't help against a boss. The main issue with Tractor is that it seems to be very situational. So the only case I see this being used is in DPS phases that are extremely long and allow you to get close to the boss without the risk of death. So a perfect example is Golgoroth. With that said, you should now know everything that is needed to make your own decision on whether or not Div is still going to be worth running, but I definitely think it will be. If you guys do want to watch me live over on Twitch, we are currently working on some speedruns and some low-man raids. There's a link to that below, along with my Discord server if you want to join the community over there. Anyways, that's all for this video, guys. As always, have a good one. Peace.